Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay, so we are back now from our break. All lively and ready to go. Okay. Chapter 8. At the beginning of chapter 8, we have the narrator telling us, "Let us strike the keynote again before pursuing the tune." When she was half a dozen years younger, Louisa had been overheard to begin a conversation with her brother one day by saying, "Tom, I wonder." Upon which Mr. Gradgrind, who was the person overhearing, stepped forth into the light and said, "Louisa, never wonder." Herein lay the spring of the mechanical art and mass mystery of educating the reason without stooping to the cultivation of the sentiments and affections. These are older terms for the emotions. Never wonder. By means of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, settle everything somehow, and never wonder. "Bring to me," says Machokum child, "yonder baby just able to walk, and I will engage that it shall never wonder." Well, okay, and then we go along and we have the people referred to as babies or simply as body number one, body number two, and so forth, as elsewhere they are referred to simply as the hands. The hands. Not as human beings, but as, girl number 20, body number 2, the hands, and so forth. Notice that what Dickens is getting at is that the system itself is dehumanizing. And we have, for example, the paradox of the library, and this is still in chapter 8. So there was a library in Coketown to which general access was easy. Mr. Gradgrind greatly tormented his mind about what the people read in this library. See that? It's one thing to give people a library, but then you have to worry about what they're actually going to read. "A point whereon little rivers of tabular statements periodically flowed into the howling ocean of tabular statements, which no diver ever got to any depth in and came up sane. It was a disheartening circumstance, but a melancholy fact, that even these readers persisted in wondering." In wondering, I mean, reading would get them to thinking and to wondering, stimulating their imaginations. They wondered about human nature, human passions, human hopes and fears, the struggles, triumphs, and defeats, the cares and joys and sorrows, the lives and deaths of common men and women. They sometimes, after 15 hours' work, sat down to read mere fables about men and women, more or less like themselves, and about children, more or less like their own. They took Defoe to their bosoms instead of Euclid, and seemed to be on the whole more comforted by Goldsmith than by Cocker. We have a footnote in my text that Cocker was the author of a treatise on arithmetic at the time. And I guess Dickens is simply assuming that you will know who Goldsmith was. And those of you who took the first half of this course with me probably will remember who Goldsmith was. Goldsmith was a poet, also a dramatist and essayist and so forth. In other words, he was a literary figure. Mr. Gradgrind was forever working in print and out of print at this eccentric sum, and he never could make out how it yielded this unaccountable product. Well, okay. We move on to chapter 9, and Sissy, who now lives in the Bounderby's household, comes home and she admits to making quite a number of mistakes in Mr. Machoakumchild's school. But what's ironic here is that each one of her supposed mistakes, as she begins to describe them, constitutes part of, and altogether they constitute, a critique of political economy as it was then being understood. Now, by political economy, what people mean, particularly in the 19th century, though the term has been revived in our time to some extent, but certainly in the 19th century, what they meant was the kind of thing that you found in Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith was the founder of classical economics, what in the history of economics is called classical economics, which is basically the theoretical as well as practical foundation for traditional capitalist economics. And it happens that Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy, and he was convinced that human nature is dominated by the desire to fulfill oneself without necessary reference to other people, and as each of us strives to achieve his or her own fulfillment, we may come into competition with one another. But that competition is precisely what produces the kind of motivation or the engine of the capitalist system. That each of us, guided by his or her own self-interest, even if bumping up against the self-interest of other people, will in that very competition push ahead the wealth of nations. And that, in a nutshell, is what Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, originally published in 1775, was about. And educated people, not only in the late 18th century, but throughout the 19th century and even beyond, were well schooled in the thought of Adam Smith. Now, what Dickens is undertaking here is not really a critique of capitalism per se, but of capitalism uncontrolled. Uncontrolled. What he wants to do is to soften the system, to give the system a heart. Okay, so Sissy, as she recounts her, quote, mistakes in school, is really giving us a kind of naive, but in many ways ironically penetrating critique of political economy as it was understood at that time. We have her coming forth, and because, you know, she's a very spontaneous person, talking about Sissy now. She's a very spontaneous and very emotional person. And so she unburdens herself about her life to Louisa and about her life with her father in particular. And we have here something in Louisa like what I said before we took our break we found in Gradgrind when he decided to take Sissy into his household. Here, Louisa responds to her, and responds to her with sympathy, responds to her with feeling. And so we begin to see some little hints of the development of an emotional life, a real emotional life in Louisa, as well as potentially in her father. And much of what's going to be happening in the plot to come is the gradual development of that kind of emotional life, and therefore the ability to make genuine human contact with other people, not simply in the cold, calculating way of the utilitarianism we saw at the beginning. Chapter 10. Here we have Stephen Blackpool, who obviously is going to become a very important character in the novel. The woman with whom he is having a relationship, which is not really a romantic relationship, and certainly not a sexual relationship, and the so-called terrible woman. Well, let's go through each of these. Stephen Blackpool is one of the ordinary workers. He is married, but his wife ran off on him and hasn't been seen for a long time. In the meantime, he has met and become friends with Rachel, who also works in the factory, and they sometimes walk home together after work, and they share a kind of friendship with one another. Now, as it happens, we learn later on, they've actually fallen in love with one another. But in their time and place, they can't really have a love affair because that would go against all of the mores and morality of their time and place. And because remember, he's married. And then at one point, his wife returns, and she is the terrible woman. She's a drunk. She squanders whatever money she can get her hands on. She is unfaithful to him. And there's even a very strong suggestion that she has become a prostitute. And so now here she is, and what's he to do? Well, of course, he must take her in and care for her, even though she's in a very, very bad way. And it falls to Rachel, really, to help to nurse this terrible woman. So that she serves a very important function in the plot. See, if she didn't exist, then why couldn't Stephen and Rachel just get together and they could get married? And at least they'd have that much happiness in their lives, their otherwise drab and dreary lives. But they can't because of her. And we're going to see how she creates even further complications for the plot in just a moment. In chapter 11, we have an example of the paternalism of the system. Paternalism in the bad sense of paternalism, not any possible good sense. Paternalism means what? What does the word itself mean? Well, yeah, it comes from the Latin word pater, for father. Yeah, that's right. But paternalism, that goes farther than just having a father or being a father. It's treating other people in a kind of condescending way as if they were small children. Okay? Now, Stephen goes to Bounderby for advice about his marriage. So notice that this paternalistic relationship works both ways. In one sense, Stephen, having been treated by the system as a child, even though he's obviously a mature man, but having been treated as a child, has internalized some of that sense of himself as a child, dependent in this case on his father for guidance. The father, in this case, not being his real father, but the factory owner and big banker who huffs and puffs and struts himself around town as a kind of father of the community. So Stcphen goes to Bounderby for advice about his marriage, and what does Bounderby do but defend the institutions of the status quo, especially the institution of marriage and of the court system, and of the court system, and of the system of law, which he interprets in the most rigid possible way, so that it excludes the rights, in this case, of Stephen Blackpool. All Stcphen wants is to get out of what clearly is a disastrous and ruinous marriage. Tries to get advice from Bounderby, and all Bounderby does is give him lectures about how everything is as it should be. And Stcphen should not rock the boat. Stcphen should simply accept his lot in the world. Now, it was not easy to get a divorce in Victorian England. It was possible, but it wasn't easy, and it generally was regarded as a kind of public scandal when people got divorced. And even often enough, the newspapers would get involved, because usually the only ground that was admitted into the courts for as grounds for divorce was adultery. And adultery would have to either be admitted to by one or the other party, or would have to be proved. And therein lay the difficulty, of course, because in the efforts to prove the grounds of adultery, you'd have a public scandal in which obviously other people and other families could become involved. This would be sensational in the yellow journalism of the time, the kind of popular pulp magazines and newspapers of the time. And Stcphen comes to realize that even if a divorce were possible for him, he could only get it if he were a wealthy person. If he had money and the power and influence that would go along with money. But as a poor man, he will never be able to be free of his wife, and therefore he will never really be able to enjoy the kind of happiness or even make the kinds of life decisions that people who are better placed than he can do. Well, then we have in chapter 12 the old woman coming in. She's going to become important in the plot also. She's introduced here, and she's going to pop up from time to time again in the plot, and then she is going to resolve an important element of the plot in the end of the novel. Over against her is a young woman, Rachel. And she is still young. Remember that Stcphen, while he's not an old man, he's in his 40s, he looks a lot older than he is, partly because of the work that he's been forced to do, which has ground him down physically and spiritually, but also because of the severe distress of being married to the terrible woman. In Rachel's case, she is still very much a young woman, and has life and has energy and has verve. And of course, this is part of the reason why Stcphen is not only attracted to her, but he's very much devoted to her. And as we get to know her better in the novel, we come to recognize how good and decent a person she is. In chapter 13, we have Rachel's compassion for Stephen's wife. so that she even serves, when she doesn't have to work, as a nurse for Stephen's wife, who is, as I said earlier, in a very, very bad way. And then one evening, Rachel, exhausted, dozes off for a couple of minutes, and when she wakes up, what does she see? She sees Stephen's wife reaching for some bottle of some kind of liquid, and we don't really have a description of it, except apparently it's poisonous. Or at least it would be poisonous if she drank the whole bottle down. And so she's about to do that. She's about to commit suicide. Now, what does Rachel do? It's very interesting. She dives over and stops the woman from drinking from the bottle, and therefore she saves her from suicide. Now, this is a very important point in the plot. What if she hadn't? You see, her and Stephen's problem would have been solved. I mean, after all, she's not killing the woman. What if she had simply sat there and let the woman commit suicide? She then would have been out of the way. The two of them could get married, and they could have at least some kind of chance for happiness in their lives. But she doesn't. And that whole scene is set up in such a way not to tell us about Stephen's wife, but to tell us something about Rachel and about her essential goodness. In chapter 14, we have a shift. Notice we're shifting back and forth. We've got two groups of characters going on. We've got the middle to upper middle class people, the Gradgrinds and the Bounderby household, and then we've got the working class people, the Stephens, the Rachels, and then eventually other working people as well. Well, and also the circus people, because while they're not working in factories, they're essentially working class people. So now we're back with the middle to upper middle class people. And we have Gradgrind expressing his disappointment with Sissy. Sissy just doesn't get it from his point of view. And so he's conveying his sense of disappointment to her. Now, eventually, he's going to be won over by Sissy, but that's something still far ahead in the plot. Along the way, he recognizes that Louisa has now become a young woman. She's no longer just a girl. And time is passing. You know, you can actually plot the passage of time in the novel. So Louisa now is a couple of years older than she was in the beginning of the novel. And she certainly, from his point of view, is not simply physically a woman, but that means to him that she has now become eligible for marriage, and that he may begin to think about the possibility of her getting married and even of looking for a suitable husband for her. And towards the end of that chapter, continuing this whole marriage theme or marriageability theme, we have Tom, Louisa's brother, asking her, Louisa, to marry Bounderby for his sake. You see, because what he wants is he wants a good cushy job with Bounderby in the bank, and he wants to have a way in with Bounderby so that he can rise in that in the bank business. Okay, and what better way than to have his sister marry Bounderby, so then he becomes the brother-in-law of his boss. Okay. In chapter 15, Gradgrind gives Bounderby's proposal to Louisa, but when he does this, it's all with facts, facts, facts. Facts about marriage, facts about age, relations between the people who are getting married, and so on and so on and so on. Now, one of the things, of course, that we obviously cannot ignore is, how old do you suppose, we're not told exactly, but how old would you say roughly he is now? Just roughly. I mean, he's not old, but, you know, he's considerably older than she. Any ideas? He's probably older than late 40s, because he was in his late 40s in the beginning of the novel, and time has passed. So he's probably around 50 or early 50s, okay, which certainly is not old, but compared to her, see, she's probably still in her teens. So there's a considerable disparity in age here, which is going to be one of the complicating factors in their relationship. Now, you know, it probably seldom happens that two people, when they marry, are exactly the same age. So there's always, or very generally, will be some age difference. How much is a lot? Well, these things are relative. You know, but certainly when you get up to 10 years between them, is that a lot? Well, I don't know. People might debate about that. 15 years? I don't know. I mean, I've known couples where there was 15 years between them and they were very, very happy. 20, 25. Now we're up to 30 plus years between them. And that's undeniably a large age difference. Okay, so here you've got this very young woman and this middle-aged man whom she does not love and doesn't even really have feelings of affection for. And you will remember that earlier on, when he kissed her on the cheek, her brother thought that she was going to rub her skin off when she took out her handkerchief and she's rubbing away at her cheek to try to remove the kiss from her cheek. She really doesn't like this guy. Well, but she becomes resigned. Her father wants it. Her father's pushing her, backed up with all of his facts and rational calculations. She has been educated in her father's system, so that up to a point, at any rate, she's going to be persuaded by his system. And she's got her brother, who is also coaxing her to marry Bounderby, of course for his own reasons, his own selfish reasons. Sissy looks at her and clearly is expressing a kind of fellow feeling toward her. But that puts off Louisa. Louisa has not yet developed emotionally enough to be able to respond to Sissy at this point. She will later on, but not yet. Remember now that we're talking about children who have been brought up according to the system that we saw at the very beginning of the novel, and which really hangs over this whole novel in a way. So that here are children who were never really allowed to develop fully as human beings, that only one side of them was developed. I mean, there's nothing wrong with developing people's rational abilities, their intellects, their abilities in mathematics and science and business and so forth. Those are all good things. But notice, this is to the exclusion of anything to do with imagination, with feeling, with wondering. Okay, chapter 16. Bounderby announces his wedding plans to Mrs. Sparsit, and of course Mrs. Sparsit is going to be really, really, really distressed by this, because what it's going to mean is that she's going to be moved out of her privileged place in the household, even out of the household itself, and reinstalled in an apartment over the bank, which is very much a step down for her socially, and also fundamentally alters her relationship with Mr. Bounderby. So she's going to try to exercise her wiles to get back at the Gradgrinds, whose young girl now, well, young woman, has married her Mr. Bounderby. Well, then we have a description of the wedding and the honeymoon as models of efficiency and utility. Now, this is very interesting, because notice they go off for their honeymoon to where? Anybody remember where they go? They go off to Lyon in France. Now you'd think, oh, what a wonderful idea. You know, a romantic honeymoon, you go off to France, you know, have wonderful time wandering around in the countryside, drinking wine, eating wonderful food, maybe, you know, going to the art galleries in the cities and so on. What a wonderful honeymoon. Well, except for Bounderby, what Bounderby wants to do, and in fact does do, is to go to the French factories to find out how they treat their workers, what levels of efficiency they have reached in their factories. So he turns the honeymoon really into a business trip. Well, well, well. Okay, so let's sum up some of the things that we have seen in Book 1. Book 1 has been called Sowing. And here we have sowing the major themes and conflicts. Sowing the major themes and conflicts. First of all, education, which consists of facts, reason, and utility, total practicality, versus the world of the circus, make-believe, fancy, or really pretty much any kind of amusement. Secondly, we have the theme of industrialism and untempered capitalism, creating physical, social, and moral degradation, especially for the poor, but not just for the poor. Also for the people who are the captains of industry, to take Carlyle's term, because the leaders of the system are themselves part of the system. Now notice that I'm using the term untempered capitalism because, once again, this is not a critique of capitalism per se. It's a critique of capitalism without a heart. Capitalism without a heart. So that Dickens doesn't want to do away with business or with business people, but simply to bring about a kind of conversion of business and business people and their way of doing business so that they recognize their fellow humanity with other people, and especially the people who work for them and with them. The kind of thing that you do have happen in the Christmas Carol, right? When Scrooge actually does at the end come to a kind of conversion, and he goes out to buy the the Christmas goose for Bob Cratchit and his family, and wants to send them presents and wants to, give Bob Cratchit a raise and not make him work on the holiday. Okay, this is the system now developing a heart, in effect. And that's not the same thing as doing away with the system entirely, but simply reforming it. Okay. We've talked about Bounderby's social Darwinism and lack of compassion for the working poor. There are even passages here. I don't want to take the time just to go through one passage and another and another and another. We've already been doing a good deal of that. Where, what does Bounderby think the working poor really want? We're not talking about indigent poor either. We're talking about the working poor. What does he think they want? Why, he thinks that they all want venison and fine liquors and liqueurs and wines and so forth. They want to live high on the hog. You see, that's what they all want. And they would be spoiled, and they wouldn't have earned it. They wouldn't have earned it. That's the most important thing. They are not worthy of these things because they have not had the strength of character, the strength of determination to prove themselves worthy of wealth and power. And of course, notice then how he treats poor Stephen when Stephen comes to him hat in hand to try to get some helpful advice and maybe even some tangible help. We've also talked about the affectation and pretense of Bounderby and Mrs. Sparsit, set over against, notice how Dickens builds his whole novel around series of contrasts, over against the genuine honesty and goodness of Sissy, Stephen, and of course, as we have noted, Rachel. Louisa, we have also seen, especially toward the end of Book 1, as trapped by her father's education because she's known nothing else. And so when he presents to her all of his arguments based on facts and calculations, that's the way she has been taught to think as well. And so she finds his arguments more or less convincing and even acceptable. And she's also trapped by her brother's manipulative love. And the reason why I've put quotes around love is that, clearly this is not a genuine kind of love, which would be genuinely concerned about her as the person whom he would claim to love. But, he's really a complicated figure in the sense that he's not totally bad. I mean, he does some really bad things in the novel, but he's really a weakling. He's really very weak. And so notice that he's led into manipulating her as part of his weakness. Well, then let's go to Book 2. If Book 1 was sowing the seeds of the novel, as it were, then Book 2 is going to be reaping. Reaping. Well, what happened as a result of the sowing in Book 1? Well, we're going to see Bitzer now back on the scene and grown up into exactly the kind of person you would think he would grow up to, after we saw him in the schoolroom in the first chapter, or in the second chapter. And so Bitzer, who is nothing but a conniving little creature, teams up with Mrs. Sparsit because both of them want to get at the Gradgrinds, and both of them want to get at the Gradgrinds through Tom. They're not going to be able to attack directly Louisa, but they can attack Tom. James Harthouse comes in, and he's kind of a dandy. He's kind of a dandy. He plays Tom for a fool and attempts to seduce Louisa. Remember, he takes Tom to his rooms, and they've not only been drinking, but he also gives Tom something to smoke, and we don't really know quite what it is, and it's never explained to us, but it seems like something that has a narcotic effect, because when Tom does come out into the street from Harthouse's rooms, comes out into the street, it's not simply that it's misty, it's that he's in a fog. His head is in a fog. He's unclear about where he is or what's going on. I mean, after all, this is the town that he grew up in, and it's not a large town. Okay, so from all of this, we can infer that Harthouse has given him something or other that may have drugged him, or at least had some kind of narcotic effect on him. It was not real common, but it wasn't totally uncommon for people to take opium or some kind of opiate concoction or for medicinal purposes. And it was actually relatively common. Laudanum was one of the principal ways in which that was done. But there were other kinds of medicinal preparations that were laced with opium. And there were people who already had been experimenting with smoking the opium. And it sort of seems like something like that is going on, even though you can't quite prove it because we don't have any concrete evidence of it in the narrative. But in any event, Harthouse really plays Tom for a fool because he sees Tom as a way of getting at Louisa. And remember that Tom is vulnerable in part because he's in debt. You know, he's got all kinds of debts now. And we're going to learn a little bit later on that he's been stealing from the bank, right? And sooner or later, the shortages are going to be discovered, and they could be traced back to him. I mean, after all, how many people would be positioned in the bank? We're not talking about a huge bank here. We're not talking about Chase Manhattan or, you know, one of the great banks of the world. We're talking about a small town bank. So how many people in the bank would be positioned in such a way that they could even get at the money in the way Tom can? Well, Harthouse is going to help, or at least claims that he's going to help Tom out with his financial difficulties. But what he really wants is to befriend Tom so that Tom will be his way of getting to Louisa. Because if Louisa truly loves her brother Tom, then she can't help but really have strong affection, if not love, for someone who has become a close friend and even a benefactor to her brother. So, Louisa is in a very vulnerable position. She is vulnerable as Bounderby's wife. He runs everything. He never consults her about anything. She doesn't seem to have any role whatsoever in making any decisions in the household. And she now is the target of Mrs. Sparsit, who's a formidable adversary. Also, we're going to get back to the other class of people. I'm talking about socioeconomic class of people now. Slackbridge and the Union. Slackbridge is the guy who comes in as not only a labor organizer, but he's a would-be leader of the union movement in the town. And from Dickens' point of view, he's simply trying to manipulate the working people for his own selfish benefit. That he's not really trying to help the working people through the union, but simply to get what he can out of them. And Stephen, of course, honest guy that he is, will speak up to his fellow workers and even to Slackbridge. And what Slackbridge does is he gets the workers to ostracize Stephen, treat him as an outsider, treat him as a complete outsider. Now notice, here's poor Stephen. He has a terrible marriage. He can't get out of it. His wife, by the way, has now gotten better, and she's taken off again. He can't marry Rachel. And given the sense of conscience that he has about these matters, and that Rachel has about these matters, they can't simply have some kind of a love affair. And he's been simply sent packing by Bounderby when he tried to get Bounderby's advice and maybe some help from him. And now he's even being ostracized by his own fellow workers. And Stephen's honest loyalty to his fellow workers, you see, is the other side of that. They are ostracizing him, but he wants to remain loyal to them. And when Bounderby calls him in for the second time, I mean, the first time Stephen was initiating the meeting between them, and now Bounderby is initiating the meeting. And what does Bounderby want to know? He wants to know what the workers are up to. But of course, Stephen is loyal to his fellow workers. And he says, well, you have only yourself to blame, in effect. I mean, these are not his exact words. Here are people who are not being paid a living wage, who have to live in the most deplorable conditions, who have to work in even worse conditions. What do you expect from the workers? Certainly, why would you expect them to be happy and contented and cheerful workers? Well, Bounderby simply bullies him in response and then fires him. So here's poor Stephen. What's he going to do? And again, it's a small town, and the town is dominated by Bounderby to a very large extent. He not only owns the factory, but he also owns the bank. And where's Stephen going to get a job? What's he going to do? How's he going to stay alive? So in chapter 6 of book 2, excuse me, we come to a turning point in the plot. It happens that chapter 6 is right at the exact middle of the novel. And so therefore, it's appropriate perhaps that it would turn out to be the turning point in the plot. Stephen prepares to leave. Again, he really has little choice. And then there's Rachel, and of course there's the pathos, not only of their relationship, but now Stephen being ostracized, fired, and forced to leave. And then we have the old woman coming in again. We find out from her herself, by the way, that her name is Mrs. Pegler. But this is the old woman whom we had seen earlier on in book 1. And I said, you know, she's going to come back later on, and she's going to be one of the agents of the plot and of the resolution of the plot. And at different times she will express her admiration for Bounderby and for his success. Well, okay. Then Louisa actually meets Stephen, one of the hands, as it were, and she meets him personally. She actually gets to talk. She's never met and actually talked to one of these people before. It would appear, at any rate. And she actually talks with him, and she realizes that she's dealing not simply with someone who is body 1 or body 2 or body 3, or simply one of the hands, not a human being, but valued only for what he can do on an assembly line with his hands. And she responds to him as a genuine human being, with genuinely human feelings herself. Notice how she is beginning to grow emotionally, and in the growth of her emotional life, she's becoming a fuller human being. And she tries to give him some money. And he won't accept the money that she offers, but he'll accept a couple of pounds, but only a couple of pounds. And so Louisa tries to get Rachel on her side to talk Stephen into taking more money. And Rachel says, the last thing I would do is to try to come between Stephen and his conscience. If this is a matter of his conscience, if this is a matter of his principle, then I'm not going to ask him to compromise his principle. And one of the things that we're learning is that the poorer people can often be much more honorable, truly honorable, than the people who are much better off financially and are much higher on the social scale. That there is true honor in Stephen. There's true honor in Rachel. There's true honor in Sissy. There's a kind of true honor among the circus people, as we will see a little bit later on. Okay, in the meantime, we have Tom developing a scheme to implicate Stephen. Now, you know, I mentioned earlier that Tom's hand has been in the till, as we sometimes say. And he's been, you know, gradually lifting some funds from the bank, and he's got to have a scapegoat. Well, Stephen is a perfect scapegoat. He's now an outcast. He's been rejected by everybody. He's been thrown out of his group of workers and friends. He's been fired by his boss. He's being forced to leave the town completely. And if his leaving the town coincides with suspicion being thrown on him that he has stolen money from the bank, then it can be imputed to him that the real reason why he's leaving the town is he's fleeing the law. And his leaving the town then becomes not something that one might sympathize with him for, but would become evidence of his guilt. Okay, so what does Tom do? He says, hey, you know, I want you to hang around the bank, you know, several late afternoons and evenings. Just hang around the bank, you know, and I'll come to you, but, you know, hang around the bank. Well, of course, Mrs. Sparsit now has been installed upstairs in an apartment over the bank to oversee what's going on. She's a kind of spy for Mr. Bounderby, and so is Bitzer. Bitzer is also an employed spy in the bank to spy on the other people working in the bank and report back to Mr. Bounderby, which of course once again tells us what kind of a guy Bitzer is. In chapters, I don't know why I don't have an S on the end of chapter there, chapters 10 through 12, this is still in book 2, we have Mrs. Sparsit's staircase, as she calls it. This is a moral staircase in which she envisions people either going up or going down the staircase. Going up to greater success and honor, going down to dishonor, even degradation. And she sees Louisa, whom she hates, she sees Louisa spending a fair amount of time, and more time actually, with, remember, Harthouse, who's out to try to seduce Louisa? With Harthouse, who's totally cynical about this. All he wants to do is to seduce her simply to make a, quote, conquest of this young woman, this attractive young woman. He doesn't really care about her. And Mrs. Sparsit sees Louisa as going down on her moral staircase and down and down and down. Well, Louisa finally goes through a kind of crisis which is really a whole emotional crisis and even a kind of psychological collapse. But that becomes the beginning of her rebirth. Sometimes it is out of such a collapse that it becomes possible to begin one's life in a whole new way. That's the kind of thing that John Stuart Mill talks about in his autobiography. Remember what I said about Mill? The younger Mill, John Stuart Mill. The author whom I mentioned last time when we were talking about what the Victorians called the woman question. He's the author of a very important treatise arguing for equality for women in the 19th century. You know, I mean, we talked about Mary Wollstonecraft making a brilliant argument or a set of arguments for equal treatment and equal opportunities for women. And of course, the leaders of that kind of feminist movement were generally women, very, very bright and articulate and determined women. But there were also men of conscience who joined them, and John Stuart Mill was one. But in his autobiography, to go back to what I was saying earlier about him, in his autobiography, he talks about the kind of upbringing he had, which was exactly what Gradgrind, Child, and Bounderby have been fostering. That's the way John Stuart Mill was reared. And he went through a terrible crisis in his life as a young adult with a psychological collapse. And he says that how he worked his way out of it at a time when there weren't therapists you could go to. You know, you couldn't go to the psychiatrist, you know, in the town or some kind of counselor. They just didn't exist. And so what he did was he did something like what Wordsworth did. Remember when Wordsworth went through a similar kind of crisis, though for different reasons? And he said that he found in poetry, Wordsworth said, he found in poetry a kind of spiritual renewal that not only helped him come out of his crisis, but come out of it as a fuller and a better human being. So also with Mill. John Stuart Mill says that it was through his discovery of poetry, especially romantic poetry, that he was able gradually to work his way out of his crisis, because what he was able to do was to develop a whole other side of his personality, which had been squashed, in effect, by his upbringing. And he has a very famous section in his autobiography where he talks about Bentham and Coleridge as presenting two opposite forces and oppositional forces in the 19th century. So, Louisa's crisis is going to actually turn out to be something very good, because she is now going to reject everything that has been imprisoning her. So we move to book 3, garnering. We had sowing, we had reaping, and now we have garnering. What you get as a result of your sowing and your reaping. We have Louisa's transformation. Not the least of the action she now takes is she leaves Bounderby. That took a lot of courage. I mean, women didn't just up and leave their husbands. It's not that it never happened, but notice how that was censured earlier when we had Stephen's wife up and left him, right? Now I realize that Stephen's wife is a far different person in character than Louisa. But the point I'm getting at is that the social mores of the time were generally intolerant of a woman leaving her husband. Now it's true they don't have children, so that doesn't become a complicating factor. But she does leave her husband. And she goes to live with her father and mother, presumably. But her mother really doesn't figure very largely in the story. In the Gradgrind family, it is the father who really dominates, though Louisa now is coming into her own. And so notice that Bounderby insists that she come back, but insists that she come back on his terms, and his terms alone. He doesn't go to her and say, I love you, what can I do? Or how can we work this out? How can we have a real marriage if this has not been a real marriage? He simply insists that she return on his terms and his terms alone. And he even sets a deadline and says, if she is not returned by noon tomorrow, then I'm simply having all of her stuff packed up and have it sent to the Gradgrind household. So at 5 minutes after noon, the next day, that's exactly what he does. And he and Mrs. Sparsit then resume the relationship that they had before. Well, okay. Louisa, now having come back, her father's going, wait a minute, what's going on here? And she says, the problem is that everything has been wrong. And I now have finally realized that there was something fundamentally wrong in the way I was educated and in the way I was reared. Well, of course, guess what kind of a crisis this creates now for Mr. Gradgrind, her father. And it doesn't happen immediately, but he gradually comes around to understanding, then sympathizing, and finally agreeing with her point of view, that he has been wrong. Once again, not that there's something wrong with developing the intellectual abilities of children or educating them in the kinds of information that they need to know, but at the expense of that whole other rich part of their lives, their emotional lives, their lives of imagination, their lives of wondering, their lives of loving and enjoying. Well, okay, and as her father is transformed by her having been transformed, notice now she really takes a position of leadership in the family, so that the family is no longer the same kind of paternalistic entity that it was earlier on. And of course, her father is now responding to her as an equal. As an equal. Harthouse and Bounderby both alienate themselves from her in order to, quote, save face. Harthouse leaves, and he's very cynical about this, because remember, he never really cared about her. He just wanted to make the conquest of seduction. Bounderby, of course, also now is going to distance himself from Louisa. He's not going to see her. He's not going to have anything to do with her. He's going to bring Mrs. Sparsit back so that he can live as a bachelor, even though technically they're still married. That is to say, Louisa and he are still married. And this also is a way of him establishing that he doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him. He has not been affected. He's not suffered. He's certainly not destroyed by her having left him. Life is going on as it ever has for Bounderby. Well, then Mrs. Sparsit, however, is exposed. And that becomes very interesting because we find out, among other things, that she really has not come from the kind of aristocratic background that she has always claimed to have come from. And the whole fiction of her narrative about herself is proved to be false. And of course, with this, Bounderby is not really going to want to have her continue. Stcphen is accused of robbing the bank in posters that Bounderby has made up and displayed all over the town. In the meantime, Stcphen, of course, is as far away as he could get until he fell down a mine shaft. The people in the locale of the mine shaft are afraid, as they say, to go near it because it's such a dangerous place. And Stcphen is down there for a long time. He looks up through the shaft and he can see a star. And that's the one thing that he can focus on that gives some kind of sense to his life and what he realizes is about to be his death. And he equates the star with the Star of Bethlehem. And here again you have a very different kind of religious view than we did earlier on when we heard about the 18 churches in the town. Once again, it's a small town, Why would they need 18 churches? But these 18 churches all appear, at least according to the authorial narrator, to have the single goal of trying to keep the working class poor people in line so that they can't have any, even the most innocent forms of enjoyment. That's set over against the very simple kind of religious piety that we find in Stcphen at the end. Rachel now is here. They've found out where Stcphen has got off to. And this is also partly with the help of the circus people, as it turns out. And so they find him down in the mine shaft, and the local people help, and they get him up out of there. But of course, he is dying. He looks up at his star, and he's being carried away on a litter or stretcher with Rachel holding his hand. He passes away. So that's the pathetic side of the story, and I mean pathetic in the classical sense. The Greek word for emotion, especially very powerful and very powerfully affecting emotions, is pathos. So in that sense, we have something which is truly a kind of pathos arousing situation. Okay. Sissy sends Tom off to Sleary's circus to escape. And so now he's dressed up in costume so that people will not recognize him for who or what he is, because see, he's had to escape. Once it had been proved that Stcphen, after all, really hadn't been the criminal who had robbed the bank, and it came to be known that Tom was the one, what does Sissy do? She tries to help him to escape by sending him off to Sleary's circus. Why does she do that? Why does she do that? Well, first of all, Bounderby hasn't really lost anything. I mean, in terms of, anything of great value. Secondly, she really has a kind of loyalty to the Gradgrind family because, remember, it was Mr. Gradgrind, and of course his family, who took her in when her father abandoned her as a child. So she still feels that strong sense of loyalty to the Gradgrind family. So, in the conclusion, we come full circle in the plot. We have Sleary's philosophy of life being outlined for us in much greater detail than earlier on, in which Sleary, who's not an educated man, but he's obviously very thoughtful and very intelligent, and in his own way, very articulate. Sleary has really a very admirable philosophy of life and how there should be balance in human life. And it's that balance that's been lost in the Gradgrinds earlier on. And so Sleary wants to repay Gradgrind's earlier kindness to Sissy when Gradgrind took Sissy in. So Sleary is going to help Tom now to get away. We have the overcoming of Bitzer and all that represents in terms of not just Bitzer, but the Bitzers of the world. The Bitzers of the world, who care about nothing and certainly not about anybody except for themselves. And by any kind of manipulation, seek only for themselves. Mrs. Pegler exposes Bounderby. Not only is Mrs. Sparsit exposed, but now Bounderby is exposed. He wasn't in rags to begin with. I mean, there's no rags to riches narrative if he was never poor in the first place. She, it turns out, was actually his mother. She never abandoned him. He grew up in very comfortable and loving circumstances, in a comfortable and loving household and family. And so, of course, he's proved to be a liar, a pretender, and a hypocrite. So we have then at the end the moral touchstones. Touchstones being the ways in which you test the moral values in the work. The positive tests of morality: Sissy, Stephen, Rachel, Sleary, and Mrs. Pegler even. These are good people. Louisa and Gradgrind are converts. And that's very important. Even if you don't start out as a Stephen or a Sissy, you can convert. You can change. But we also have the negative touchstones: Bounderby, Harthouse, Tom, Bitzer, and Mrs. Sparsit. These are the ones who, in Tom's case, is simply weak. But with the other people, they are cold and manipulative. So, we come to the end of the novel, and isn't it wonderful? Okay.